keeper slash sex therapist person for this whatever institution this is. So it was interesting. It was an interesting meditation. What did you think?
Oh, anytime there's no plot in a story, I just tear it to pieces. I try to invent a plot. Like I'm thinking because the stories she was telling were kind of criminal. I'm thinking, okay, maybe she has a criminal background, or maybe she has even more criminal experiences.
Hmm.
And this is like this guy is also maybe he's part of the yakuza, or he's home ridden for security reasons, so he can't go outside. People are looking for him. He knows something, whatever.
Hmm.
So the yakuza bring this housewife of two
Hmm.
kids to
Yeah.
buy him magazines and DVDs and have sex. It's like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Why is this happening? Why is she doing this? So I'm assuming she got hooked up into some sort of criminal
Yeah.
underworld, but she's still, she's not a crazy lunatic. She's not a murderer. So
Mm.
she's trying to service this fellow as much as possible.
Yeah.
And this happens, and then she starts telling him these stories, and they're obviously personal to her because
Hmm.
there's no reason for her to tell him stories. There's absolutely no reason.
Yeah.
And then to him, his entire life, his entire existence is to hear these stories. He doesn't care about anything else.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking there, like, why, like, how did this come to? I'm more interested in the premise of the story, which was never explained,
Hmm.
than her obsession over her crush in high school.
Yeah.
So it's like, why are you telling me this story? I want to know what the hell's going on first.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting to me as I was thinking about it was this was a story that would have worked uh, as a, I think in a way it worked as a novel where you could have had these two narratives going, like you say, like maybe the guy's got mob ties and he's in witness protection or something like that,
Right.
and yeah, and then from there, her life story. She starts telling him her life story while they're together. You almost like the English Patient or something like that, and that could have worked. I was just kind of fascinated by the idea, and I'm not going to lie, just having a woman to come over and make love and leave without any financial obligation whatsoever is very appealing. But um, that whole thing was interesting to me. I understand what you're saying though about the kind of missing elements of it. The next story we're getting into, Kino, to me was okay, but it's funny. Kino could have been, as you're describing it, Kino could have been the wider universe
Yeah.
that previous story because it is about the mob and it's about this
We
woman that's
we
in trouble with
think
the
it's
mob.
about the mom.
I think, yeah. This Kino, it was interesting, but this one was the weakest one in the bunch for me. Did not it touched on one of the interesting moments that I like is the whole idea of this guy being trapped in this room and in this hotel room, and there's somebody pounding on the door, and he doesn't answer it. I like that unresolved thing. That's something that Murakami, I think, does well, where he'll have these moments where we're intentionally not resolving something, some question about what is this thing, this pounding that I'm hearing or whatever. And it is kind of an obvious, I think, metaphor for like a truth that is seeping into this guy's consciousness and everything. That's kind of a truth that's kind of pushing its way into his mind, and that he's trying to block out. And that's again something that we've seen in previous stories in this volume. But this guy's trying very hard to push this realization away, and it's manifesting in the form of this pounding on the door. That said, there is a lot in this story that's not explained, that needs to be explained, and it's another story that would have been a great setup for a novel. And the reason I keep saying that, if you read *The Elephant Vanishes*, which is one of his older books of short stories, one of the short stories in that volume uh, is one of these weird little stories that doesn't resolve or explain very much or go anywhere, that he then took and turned into the Windup Bird Chronicle, which is by most accounts his greatest work, his magnum opus. And I agree, it's a fantastic book. It's one that will change your life. And Stefan, I had mentioned before we started recording that I'd like at some point to go back and read one of the classic Murakami stories to see what you think, get a different vibe. And that would be the one. I mean, that's the one that I would instantly recommend to anybody. It's an absolutely fascinating story. And that all came out of this short story that in and of itself didn't really do very much. And that with both of these two stories we just looked at, that would be, both of these are setups for great larger stories. They just need to keep going. We don't even have to answer all of the questions. You can leave some things hanging, but just more of these worlds. We need to know more. We need to explore more, So we come to Samsa in Love. This one was this is the one in the story that I had actually read before the book came out because it was published in the New Yorker. And this one is interesting because you have to. I was trying to imagine if someone didn't know the origin of this story, what they would make of it. But this is a sequel to Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and Samsa is obviously Gregor Samsa. And what has happened is this is now, if you know how The Metamorphosis ends, it ends with Gregor Samsa, who has been turned, in that story, has been turned into a giant insect, has been metamorphosized into this giant insect. It ends with him dying and his family boarding up the windows and leaving the house behind. And this is the story of that dead insect turning back into Gregor Samsa, and Gregor Samsa waking up with no real memory of what has happened, and kind of in a state of amnesia, and wandering this deserted house trying to figure out what's going on. And he meets a woman, obviously, hence the larger theme in the story. But I liked this idea because I liked the idea of continuing the story of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Because if you just read the Metamorphosis, it is kind of like life sucks and then you die. This kind of put a new spin on that, put a new angle on it. I liked this one. This one was kind of, it's fun, it's quirky, it's kind of a neat idea. What did you think?
It was definitely the strangest out of all the bunch. It was definitely more comedic and lighthearted. Very, very odd. But yeah, if you didn't know Kafka, you'd be totally lost as to what the devil is going on. Mm-hmm. Any story that has a character who has amnesia or short-term auditory memory loss, or like the movie Memento, the guy just can't remember past 10 minutes. It's kind of a little gimmick, right? Mm. But he still has to be a character. So if he's running around as a newborn in an adult body, there has to be some explanation as to what's going on. And they're really, where did the breakfast come from? Where did the doors who called this person to unlock the door or fix the lock? All these little details, they need to be addressed, at least, not explained, but at least addressed until you can say, okay, there's some normalcy here, even though you might be in some war-torn situation or whatever. So it was very refreshing compared to the way that the previous two affected me. So I was like, okay, he's having a good time, he's just relaxing and telling a silly. It was cute. It wasn't horrible or just for the sake of being silly. If there's actually some substance there. But yeah, it was pretty much for stranger in a strange land. What's going on here? I don't know. Well, it's over there. So yeah, it was a lot lighthearted, and I don't think it follows the theme of Men Without Women in that sense. It's pretty much just, as you said, a continuation of Kafka.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like, most short story collections are collections of stories that were previously published in magazines and different periodicals and newspapers or what have you, and they tend to get kind of put into books around a specific theme, where it's kind of like we did Deathbird stories, and all those stories are about gods, modern gods. And again, by another Harlan Ellison, great Harlan Ellison, is Angry Candy, and that one's all the stories are about death in some way. And so that was really what that felt like here. It was an inclusion where it's like, well, this is where we could publish this story and it would kind of be thematically related. But you're right, it's really not. It really doesn't connect with the rest of the stuff. It felt like, what I love, not to get off on a huge aside, but what I love are like collections of short films. You go in the video store, that ancient history, but like you go in a video store or something, and you find a collection of short films, and it's not just like you're on YouTube clicking through various amateur film projects. They're all around a theme, and you're going through a set of ideas. The Animatrix is a great example of that, and that's kind of what this book felt like in a way. It did almost, and it's stories like this one. This felt like it was something by a totally different director. A movie by a different director. It is one of those interesting stories to me, though. It's always interesting to me when a writer uses characters by another writer, uses thematic elements. One of my favorite examples of this, and as I'm thinking aloud, it'd be a great episode of Book Talk. Either we would be profoundly moved or we'd be laughing hysterically the whole time. There's a book by Frederick Tutton called Tintin in the New World, and it's about Tintin, the comic book character, the children's graphic novel character, growing up and falling in love. And I've read part of it. I read part of it in college and just had to stop because you had to really understand it. You have to have also read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, because he just literally takes every character from The Magic Mountain and drops them into this story. And it's like, why? You have, not only do you have to know Tintin, you have to know Thomas Mann to fully get this one freaking book. That said, there is some beautiful writing in there, and Frederick Tutton is a excellent writer. But it's like, if you don't know all of the background to this, you are completely up a creek without a paddle. So that brings us to the last story, which is Men Without Women. This one almost felt more like an epilogue to me. You talk about a framing device. This felt like the conclusion of a framing device to me, because it's not a very complicated story. It literally just, and it feels like the person we're talking about here is Haruki Murakami. But it literally is just about this guy getting a call from someone to finding out that this woman he loved has passed away, and his just kind of ruminating on that. And it is where we get into what we were talking about earlier, about that this is about men who have experienced women and lost them or been separated from them in some way. It's not about involuntary celibates and losers and, outcasts and that kind of thing. It's about men who are experiencing the pain of not having a specific woman, which is what this is about. And this story is even about, this guy has moved on, he's married somebody else, he's moved on with his life, but still the pain of knowing that this woman is no longer around is overwhelming. So that's basically the idea. There's some great ideas in there. It's not really much of a story.
Yeah, it's pretty much an abstract where he doesn't have a story, or he doesn't have a dramatic point, or he doesn't have anything to really put into a narrative. And he's saying, well, this is, like, he doesn't even name the woman. I think it's just M. And it's just like, okay, well, he's trying to tell us, this is pretty much the author just telling us in his best way without literally telling us in a letter, saying, this is what happens to men. We get clouded, we get caught up in this one woman in our lives, and it affects us for the rest of our being, which is what we just, I talked about at the start here, that, yeah, we constantly go back. It's always going to be there. And once we are aware of that, we can then say, okay, that's it. He never says that, oh, now we can get past this, or now we can grow further. He just says, no, this is it. You're stuck.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the author's telling us, you're screwed. You're your guy. Yeah. You have emotions, and you've hit a wall, and you cannot surpass this wall. Which is, you could take that for what it's worth. Depending on your emotional stability and how you deal with women and people and what have you. So yeah, I wouldn't even grade it on a story level. I would just say, yeah, I mean, this is what I did not like, because if you're going to title your piece, it should be with the theme, or it should be just this is like anthology book number 1, or this is short story book number 2,
Yeah.
or name it after something which is cute,
Yeah.
like I don't know, banana fish or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's really not much to say here aside from the author just sort of taking an aside and going, okay,
Hmm.
by the way, this is
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah, it was kind of like it was just it was a summation, it was a summary of the
Almost, yeah.
ideas that we've been dealing with throughout these stories. So one piece of analysis I'd like to offer as a vintage Murakami reader, or a veteran Murakami reader rather, is, you mentioned that she's not given a name, she's just called M. And there's other places where he does things like that, and that one letter initial to name a person is something that comes, you see in a lot of Franz Kafka's writing. You have K is the main character in America, in The Castle, the Trial. It's Joseph K. and that kind of thing. And obviously we're realizing this is Kafka. This is Kafka experiencing this, is why it's K. And Haruki Murakami's two big influences as a writer are Franz Kafka and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it's interesting if you know that, reading this stuff, because you think about The Great Gatsby, which is obviously the quintessential F. Scott Fitzgerald work. The Great Gatsby is about one person, but there is a narrator set up just pretty much just for the purpose of telling the story of this person. So we have Nick Carraway, or as he's called in Family Guy, Nick the Situation Carraway. But you have Nick Carraway that's telling the story of Gatsby, and that's a theme that Murakami and that The Great Gatsby could very obviously be a men without women story with a lot of the themes that Murakami's been exploring in this book. So there's that aspect of his writing, and then there's the Franz Kafka aspect of his writing, which, Samsa in Love was very much an homage to Kafka in a lot of ways. So with that in mind, we come to the final question we always ask ourselves: would you recommend it?
Oh, geez. No, I would not. I think Murakami is a very talented writer. I think this was not, it wasn't a sloppy anthology, but it's not an anthology. It's trying to be an anthology. Some of the stories don't work with the theme. And if he just wants to make an anthology, just make an anthology saying, I'm going to write a bunch of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And do that, and we'll appreciate it for what it's worth. I got confused, as I've just found out. The first three
Yeah.
stories were not connected, so that's how lost I was. And some of these stories, they have some really good parts to them, but for the most, like for the other parts, they're like, even Kino, I was like, what is, like, why, like, why is this? Why are these events happening? So obviously he's not focused on plot and character so much as situations and events,
Mm-hmm.
and the profound meaning and emotion behind them, which is not always clear. So it's meant to be interpretive. The problem with interpretation is you need to have a base for things like subtlety to come out, for color, other colors to come from that one color. You need something to wrap your brain around. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have that, and only these are in some of his stories that don't make sense, and
Yeah.
that's the problem. I expect, if you're going to do an anthology, each story must be independent of the others,
Mm-hmm.
and if they're not, then they're not complete stories. So
Right.
he could have gotten away with this if, uh, Men Without Women in Kino represented a certain aspect of that element, and
Mm-hmm.
then that was then brought into. It doesn't matter how setting, character, timeline, whatever, from the previous story or the next story, that would have worked. I would have seen what he was doing there. In this case, I could not see any connection between a lot of these stories, and the theme was just not there in some of them as well.
Yeah. I I would say, as a vintage Murakami reader, a longtime fan, start. This is, if you are an established Murakami fan, And obviously, as you can tell, this is a newbie versus an oldie, so to speak, in terms of appreciation. Um, if you are a lifetime Murakami fan, a diehard Murakami fan like I am, you'll enjoy this, and I enjoyed it. And you probably, if you know the way he writes and that kind of thing, what it feels like, I think, what it feels like to me, and the reader, the listeners probably picked up on some of this too. What it feels like to me is that Murakami here is not, he's just writing for he's kind of preaching to the choir, like he's just writing for the people who are insanely familiar, or just intimately familiar with everything he's done. And he doesn't have to really establish a whole lot, because it's kind of like you're just kind of thinking, oh, this is Murakami being Murakami. There's actually, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I think it was either the Guardian or the Huffington Post actually ran a cartoon, a huge, like, full-page editorial cartoon that was called Haruki Murakami Bingo, and it's a bingo sheet of all of these things that keep showing up in Murakami's books. So it was things like weird sex, mysterious woman, feeling of being followed, underground passage, precocious teenager, and it's all of these, and these are all things that show up, the precocious teenager is usually a girl, is another recurring element, character in his stories under different names. And so yeah, and just like that, you could go through with this and play and win a round of Murakami Bingo with this book. So it's very well-worn territory for him. And this is, if you're going to get into Murakami, though, if you're discovering Murakami, read, for the Franz Kafka surrealist aspect of his writing, read the Windup Bird Chronicle, read Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, read Kafka on the Shore, hence the title. For the F. Scott Fitzgerald aspect of his writing, read Norwegian Wood, read Colorless Sakura Tozaki and His Years of Pilgrimage, read South of the Border, East of the Sun, South of the Border, West of the Sun, excuse me. And then there are other books, like After Dark is a blend of both of those worlds that he writes in. So is Sputnik Sweetheart. So, yeah, get started elsewhere, and I would say start with Windup Bird Chronicle. All right, so that wraps up this edition of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. Join us in August when our book will be Trigger Warning by Neil Gaiman.